There are women in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who are in their 70s and 80s with hair so dense, so long, and so visibly healthy that the first time you see it, you genuinely stop and think you must be misreading their age. No thinning at the crown. No fragile, transparent strands catching the light. Just full, strong hair, worn up under a prayer cap, grown for decades without a single visit to a salon. And when you ask them what they use, the answer is always shorter than you expect. That is where this story begins. If you have noticed your hair thinning after 50, if you are finding more on your pillow or in the drain than you used to, if you have spent money on thickening shampoos and biotin supplements and silk pillowcases and none of it moved the needle in any meaningful way, then what I am about to share with you is going to reframe what you think you know about hair aging. Not because it is a miracle, but because the practice behind it has almost a century of quiet evidence and the reasons you have never heard of it are not accidental. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something. The practices I am going to walk you through today are inspired by the traditional methods of old order Amish communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio. I am not speaking for those communities or claiming any official endorsement from them. What I am doing is following a thread that starts in those communities and leads somewhere most women over 50 have never been pointed toward. If that kind of investigation is what you come here for, and I think it is, stay with me. The story of why your hair thins after menopause is one the modern hair industry has a complicated relationship with, because understanding the real mechanism means understanding that most of what is sold to address it is designed to treat a symptom while preserving the purchase cycle. Let me explain. Hair thinning in women over 50 is primarily driven by two things working together. The first is a drop in estrogen and progesterone after menopause, which shortens the hair's active growth phase. Each strand spends less time growing and enters the resting and shedding phase earlier than it did when you were younger. The second factor, the one nobody in the shampoo aisle talks about, is scalp health. Specifically, the condition of the scalp's sebaceous glands and its microcirculation, meaning how well blood actually reaches the follicle to feed it. A poorly fed follicle produces a thinner, shorter, more fragile strand with every cycle. Over time, those cycles add up, and what you see is a scalp that gradually becomes more visible through the hair. Modern products overwhelmingly address the strand, not the follicle. They coat, they add protein, they add volume, the way a padded bra adds volume. The hair looks fuller for one wash. The follicle is unchanged. The Amish approach goes to the follicle first. It always has. Now here is where the history becomes interesting and where a few dates matter. In 1925, a researcher named René Maurice Gattefoss, a French chemist who had been working with plant-based aromatic compounds, published work on the therapeutic properties of what we now call essential oils. His documentation of rosemary oil specifically noted its stimulating effect on circulation in peripheral tissue. That is pure documented history. What it meant for scalp application was not lost on traditional communities that had already been using rosemary preparations on hair and scalp for generations before Gattefoss wrote a single word. They were not waiting for validation. They already knew. By the 1950s, the American synthetic cosmetic industry was consolidating rapidly. Petrochemical-derived ingredients were cheaper to produce and had longer shelf lives than plant-derived ones. Between 1950 and 1970, dozens of traditional botanical ingredients that had been standard in pharmacopoeias, meaning official pharmaceutical reference guides, were quietly reclassified, discontinued, or simply abandoned by mainstream manufacturers because they could not be patented and scaled the same way a synthesized compound could. Rosemary extract for scalp use was never banned. It was simply not profitable enough to champion. Then, in 1994, the FDA tightened its framework around what could be claimed on a cosmetic label versus what required drug classification. Any product that claimed to affect a biological function, such as stimulating hair growth at the follicle level, was pushed into drug territory, which meant clinical trials, massive investment, and years of regulatory process. The result was predictable. Manufacturers stopped making those claims. The ingredients behind them did not disappear, but the knowledge linking them to specific biological effects was systematically removed from consumer-facing communication. You could sell a rosemary shampoo. You could not tell women what it actually did to their scalp tissue without triggering a regulatory problem. The Amish never needed a label claim. They needed results, and they kept the practice. Here is the core of what that practice looks like, distilled from what traditional Amish women in these communities have done for generations, and increasingly what modern research is beginning to confirm. The scalp is treated as skin first. That sounds obvious until you realize that most of us treat our scalp as a launch pad for our hair, something to cleanse and move past as quickly as possible. Amish women have historically treated scalp care as a separate, deliberate practice from hair washing. Once or twice a week, a small amount of an oil preparation, traditionally containing rosemary and sometimes combined with a carrier like castor oil or sunflower oil, is worked into the scalp with sustained manual pressure, not massaged in a gentle spa-adjacent way. Real, firm, slow pressure applied with the fingertips in small circular movements for several minutes. This is not about the oil alone. The mechanical stimulation of the scalp increases local blood flow, which is measurable. A study published in the journal ePlasty in 2016 actually documented that standardized scalp massage over 24 weeks produced measurable increases in hair thickness. The oil is the vehicle. The pressure is half the mechanism. The second element is what is not done. Old order Amish women do not use sulfate-based cleansers on their scalp daily, because historically they had no access to them and developed no habit around them. The scalp's natural sebum, the oil your sebaceous glands produce, is not stripped away multiple times a week. A healthy scalp produces sebum that conditions the follicle opening and maintains the pH balance that keeps the follicle environment hospitable. Stripping it repeatedly with aggressive detergents stresses the follicle and triggers overproduction, which creates the oily then dry cycle that a great deal of modern shampoo marketing is actually built on. The third element is internal, and it is one I want to be straightforward about. The hair density you see in these communities is not solely explained by topical practice. Diet matters significantly. Traditional Amish diet is high in animal fats, eggs, and whole grains, and very low in processed seed oils and refined sugar. The nutrients that support follicle function, including biotin, zinc, protein, and fat-soluble vitamins, are present consistently over a lifetime, not supplemented in a capsule to make up for a diet that depletes them. You cannot fully replicate the results of this tradition with a scalp oil if your diet is working against your follicle health at the cellular level. That is not a caveat I am sneaking in at the end. That is half the picture. I want to tell you about a woman I came across in the course of putting this together. She is 68 years old, raised outside Lancaster, not Amish herself, but the granddaughter of a woman who was. She is a retired nurse, spent 35 years in clinical settings, and she started the scalp oil ritual her grandmother taught her when she was in her early 50s, after she noticed the part of her hair beginning to widen. She uses a combination of rosemary-infused olive oil and cold-pressed castor oil, about a quarter-size amount, twice a week, with what she described as a 4-minute firm scalp massage before washing. She spends less than $8 a month on the ingredients. 3 years in, she says her hairdresser, the one she sees twice a year for a trim, asked her what she had changed. Not a dramatic transformation story, a quiet, documented shift. That is actually what real results look like. They are not dramatic. They accumulate. There is a 2023 randomized controlled trial published in Skincare and Dermatology Open Access comparing rosemary oil to 2% minoxidil, which is the active ingredient in Rogaine, for hair regrowth over 6 months. Rosemary oil performed comparably. What that study did not receive was a 9-figure marketing budget. Minoxidil's patent history goes back to the 1970s. And by the mid-1980s, it had already been repositioned from a blood pressure drug into a hair loss treatment, a story of pharmaceutical rebranding that the FDA's own records document in detail. The industry around that single ingredient is worth billions annually. Rosemary oil cannot be owned by anyone. Now, I want to give you the honest version of all of this. because I think you are owed that. This practice does not stop hair thinning that is primarily hormonal in origin. If your follicles have already gone fully dormant, meaning the hair loss has been significant and sustained over many years, topical stimulation has limited ability to reverse that. What this practice does most reliably is slow the progression of thinning, maintain the health and thickness of the hairs that are still actively growing, and improve scalp condition in ways that support better future growth cycles. It is not a restoration tool for advanced loss. It is a maintenance and preservation tool, and it works best when started before the thinning becomes severe. That distinction matters, and I would rather you know it clearly than discover it after 6 months of expectation. For the practice itself, the most important variables are the oil temperature, the pressure, and the time. The oil should be slightly warm, not hot, body temperature or just above. Cold oil does not penetrate the outer layers of scalp skin in a useful way. The pressure should be firm enough that you feel the scalp moving against the skull, not just your fingers moving across hair. And the time matters more than the ingredients. Less than 3 minutes does not produce the circulation effect. 4 to 5 minutes is a realistic minimum. The frequency that appears most supported by the available evidence is 2 to 3 times per week, not daily. Daily application of any oil will cause buildup at the follicle opening if not properly cleansed, which can actually impair rather than support follicle function. This is a practice with a rhythm, not a constant. If you are washing your hair daily with a sulfate-heavy shampoo, the single most impactful change you can make before you even add the oil ritual is reducing that frequency. Give your scalp the time to produce and maintain its own oil. This is the part that costs nothing. The modern hair industry is not entirely without useful tools. I am not here to tell you to throw everything away. But there is a structural reason why the practices that cost very little and cannot be patented do not appear in the editorial content of the magazines you read in your 40s, or in the recommendations of the stylists who sell you product, or in the skincare influencers who are, most of them, 32 years old and partnered with brands. The information economy around aging hair is shaped by what is profitable to sell, not by what the evidence most consistently supports. That is not a conspiracy. It is just economics. But it is worth naming. What the Amish tradition offers is not mysticism. It is a practice preserved in a community that was never swept into the commercial cycle by women who had no reason to change something that was working. The continuity is the proof. Not a clinical trial, although we now have those too. The continuity. If you are over 50 and you have been watching your hair change and feeling like the options in front of you are either expensive and ineffective or medically aggressive, this is a third option that has been sitting quietly in Pennsylvania for 100 years. Drop your state in the comments and tell me what you currently spend on hair products every month. I am genuinely curious what that number is across this audience, because I think it would tell a story on its own. And if your grandmother or your great-grandmother had a hair or scalp practice she passed down, something she used that came before anything you would find in a store, I want to hear about it. Those details matter more than you might think, and they belong in this conversation. If you are the kind of woman who believes that useful, honest knowledge about your own body has been systematically deprioritized to protect a market, you already know what to do with a channel like this one. Next time, the Amish hair rinse the FDA attempted to classify as drug grade in 1978, the specific ingredient it contained, and the reason the reclassification effort ultimately failed. The documents are public record. The story has never been told the way it deserves to be told.